A ruthless biker's boot struck a dog for fun. What he didn't know was that the animal belonged to Keanu Reeves. In that instant, a peaceful afternoon spiraled into a battle of loyalty, cruelty, and justice. But what happened next would leave an entire city stunned. Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. The California sun pressed down on downtown Los Angeles, turning the sidewalks into shimmering plates of heat. Film crews moved quickly, breaking down cameras, folding stands, and rolling cables into heavy coils. The day's final scene had just wrapped, and the buzz of relief drifted across the set as workers chatted about lunch and a break from the relentless light. Keanu Reeves stood quietly to the side, leather jacket slung over one shoulder. He had spent hours under the cameras, yet his attention wasn't on himself. His gaze settled on Shadow, the gray and white pit bull sitting patiently at his feet. The dog's chest rose and fell with steady pants, tongue out, eyes following Keanu's every move. Keanu reached down, brushing a hand along Shadow's broad head, fingers moving behind the ears in slow, familiar strokes. The dog leaned into the touch, tail thumping the pavement. It was a simple exchange, one no one else on the busy set noticed, but to Keanu it carried a quiet weight. After years of loneliness and loss, moments like this reminded him why Shadow wasn't just a pet. He was family. "You've had enough of the lights," Keanu said softly, voice low enough that only Shadow could hear. "Let's get some air." A crew member waved, calling out an invitation to join the group heading to a nearby diner. Keanu smiled politely, shaking his head. Lunch could wait. Shadow had been patient all morning, enduring the bustle, the shouting, the heat. What he needed now wasn't another hour waiting. It was a walk. Keanu clipped the leash onto the dog's collar, the movement deliberate and secure. His hand lingered, testing the clasp twice, making sure it was firm. Shadow's ears twitched, tail beating harder against Keanu's leg. He knew the meaning of the leash. It was time. His body leaned forward with anticipation, strong muscles tense, ready to go. "Easy," Keanu whispered, with a small chuckle, steadying him with a light tug. The street beyond the set was alive with city rhythm. Horns blared, brakes hissed. A street musician strummed a weary guitar. Yet beneath the urban soundtrack came another noise. Low, distant, and unsettling. The faint rumble of motorcycles, drifting through the air from blocks away. Most passers-by ignored it, but Keanu's eyes flicked toward the sound. He looked down at Shadow, who pawed lightly at the ground, oblivious to the noise. Keanu exhaled, convincing himself it was nothing more than another hum of the city. Still, the sound left a trace of unease, like a warning carried on the air. Adjusting his jacket, he tucked the collapsible water container into his pocket and gave a nod to the crew. Then he stepped off the curb, Shadow trotting faithfully beside him. Each step carried them away from the safety of the set and closer to the unpredictable streets beyond. The first few blocks felt almost peaceful. Keanu kept a steady pace, Shadow trotting beside him with a loose leash, his nose twitching at every new scent. The city was alive in its usual way. Vendors calling out near food carts, office workers spilling into the streets for a late lunch, cars crawling through intersections. Yet, even with the ordinary noise, Keanu's focus remained on Shadow. Every few steps he reached down to pat the dog's head or give the leash a reassuring tug, making sure his companion stayed comfortable. They paused near a tree at the corner of a quieter street where Keanu crouched to check the pavement. The asphalt was hot, but Shadow's paws showed no signs of discomfort. Keanu pulled the collapsible water container from his pocket, filling it at a small fountain nearby. Shadow lapped eagerly at the water, splashing droplets against the concrete. Keanu smiled faintly. watching his dog drink with the kind of patience only a man who truly cared could show. "Better?" he asked softly once the bowl was empty. Shadow gave a short wag of his tail, licking the last drops from his muzzle. Keanu stayed crouched a moment longer, brushing the dog's back, eyes catching small details on the street around them. Graffiti scrawled across a nearby wall, dark letters sprayed over faded paint. A broken bottle glimmered in the gutter. Two men loitered by a closed shop front, their shoulders tense, their conversation hushed but heated. It wasn't unusual for Los Angeles, but the atmosphere held an edge today, as though the city itself was waiting for something to happen. From the distance came another reminder. The deep growl of motorcycle engines, louder now, closer. The sound rolled through the street like thunder, powerful enough to make Shadow's ears twitch. The dog didn't bark, but his head turned sharply in the direction of the noise. Keanu straightened, eyes narrowing, though his hand on the leash remained calm. He took a slow breath, forcing the tension from his shoulders. He had lived long enough to know that suspicion alone could color everything darker than it was. The motorcycles could be anyone, passing through like thousands did each day. He reminded himself not to jump to conclusions. Still, as the sound lingered in the air, he couldn't shake the feeling that the city's energy had shifted. They resumed their walk. Shadow padded close to his side, his powerful frame moving with surprising grace for a dog his size. Children at a nearby playground called out when they saw him, pointing and smiling, and Shadow responded with a gentle wag of his tail. Keanu offered them a nod, grateful for the simple, wholesome distraction. For a moment, the tension eased. But just ahead, the city opened into a narrower side street lined with old buildings, some boarded up, others barely maintained. It was quieter here, away from the main flow of traffic. Keanu glanced up at the faded awning of a small cafe he remembered passing once before. It looked calm, shaded, with a few empty tables outside. He considered stopping. Shadow could use another rest, and perhaps he could finally get a bite to eat. He didn't know that the choice to step into that cafe's direction would change the course of the entire afternoon. Keanu guided Shadow down the narrower street, his footsteps echoing faintly against the walls of aging buildings. The air felt heavier here, less busy than the main avenues, the kind of quiet that wasn't restful, but waiting. A delivery truck idled near the curb, its driver leaning against the hood while smoking a cigarette, eyes flicking toward Keanu and his dog, with a look that lingered a little too long. Keanu offered a polite nod but received nothing more than a blank stare in return. Shadow stayed close, his leash slack yet purposeful, as though the dog could sense his owner's quiet alertness. He sniffed at the cracks in the sidewalk, pausing once to glance back over his shoulder. Keanu followed his gaze, but saw only the shimmer of heat rising from the pavement and a pair of teenagers weaving past on skateboards. Still, the rumble of motorcycles hadn't disappeared. It rolled again in the distance, deep and mechanical, the kind of sound that carried like a storm preparing to break. Keanu slowed his steps and placed a hand against Shadow's broad shoulders, steadying both the dog and himself. He drew in the atmosphere around him, letting his senses catalog each detail: the graffiti-covered walls, the faint echo of laughter from a bar 2 blocks away, the silence of upper windows with curtains drawn tight. Something about the scene pressed at the back of his mind, but then his eyes landed on the cafe. A chalkboard sign leaned against the doorway, its letters faint from sun and rain, promising fresh coffee and daily sandwiches. Strings of lights hung over the small outdoor seating area, though only a few bulbs remained intact. For all its weathered appearance, the place offered shade, quiet, and space enough for a man and his dog. Shadow tugged gently toward it, his tail sweeping side to side as if casting the deciding vote. Keanu let out a low breath, the smallest of smiles forming as he adjusted his grip on the leash. "All right, boy," he said, voice soft but certain. "Let's take a break." With that, he turned toward the cafe's entrance. The world outside seemed to hold its breath for a moment, the air still and heavy. Keanu didn't notice the small group of motorcycles parked several blocks behind, their chrome frames catching the sunlight like blades. He didn't see the figures leaning against them, watching the street with sharp eyes. For now, he and Shadow walked calmly toward the shaded tables, unaware that what waited ahead would test loyalty, courage, and the quiet bond between man and dog. The narrow side street spilled out into a wider avenue, and almost immediately the tone of the neighborhood shifted. Keanu slowed his steps, his eyes scanning the buildings ahead. Neon beer signs flickered in dusty windows. Metal bars covered most of the doors, and the walls were plastered with stickers from motorcycle rallies. At the far corner stood a structure that seemed to draw the air tighter around it. Its faded sign, outlined in cracked red paint, spelled out a name in jagged letters: Steel Fang. Shadow tugged on the leash, not toward the door of the bar, but toward a squat, weathered water fountain set just a few feet from the row of gleaming motorcycles lined in front. Their chrome frames caught the afternoon sun, gleaming like the teeth of predators. The bikes were massive, polished yet scarred from use, each bearing the same patch logo on the saddlebags and vests hanging over the handlebars. A snarling wolf with dripping fangs. Keanu tightened his grip on Shadow's leash, instinctively cautious. He could feel the weight of eyes from the entrance even before he looked up. A cluster of men leaned against the walls outside the bar, their bodies draped in leather, their arms inked with tattoos that curled across muscle like coiled serpents. The smell of cigarette smoke hung thick in the air, blending with the sour tang of spilled beer that seeped from the cracked floorboards inside. Shadow paused at the fountain, lowering his head toward the stream of water, his tongue flicking eagerly as Keanu knelt to fill the collapsible bowl. The city heat had pressed against them for blocks, and the sound of the dogs lapping was almost comforting, a slice of normalcy in a place that radiated anything but. But the comfort didn't last. A bottle clinked sharply against the pavement, the sound deliberate. Keanu's eyes flicked sideways, catching the smirk of a biker who had tossed it from the shadows near the door. Another leaned closer, muttering something under his breath that made the others laugh in low, menacing tones. Keanu didn't respond. He had learned long ago that silence could be as powerful as confrontation. He focused instead on Shadow, steadying the dog's broad shoulders with his hand, speaking softly as the animal drank. Yet he couldn't ignore the atmosphere pressing in around him. The measured hostility, the way conversations dropped to a hush when he looked their way, the metallic scrape of a boot against concrete as one of them shifted deliberately, marking territory without words. From inside the bar came the muffled crash of pool balls and the rise of voices, sharp and aggressive, spilling into the street like the echo of a storm about to break. The door swung open briefly and a waitress stepped out, balancing a tray of empties. She was young, her blonde hair tied back hastily, her apron stained from hours of serving. Her eyes flicked to Keanu and Shadow, then to the bikers lounging near the entrance. A flash of concern crossed her face. She moved toward him quickly, her voice low enough to pass beneath the growl of engines idling down the street. "You should be careful here," she murmured, glancing nervously at the row of vests. "They've been trouble for months. Some folks won't even walk this way anymore." Keanu nodded once, a subtle acknowledgement, his voice even. "Thanks. We'll just finish here and move on." Shadow raised his head from the water, dripping muzzle wet, tail giving a short wag. Keanu rubbed the dog's side, preparing to stand, but as he did, one of the bikers closest to the entrance shifted forward. His lips curled into a grin that was all teeth, no warmth. His eyes didn't look at Keanu at all. They fixed directly on Shadow, as though the dog himself had been marked. The grin widened, deliberate and slow. The biker who stepped forward was tall, his shoulders broad beneath a patched vest that bore the snarling wolf insignia. His hair was shaved close on the sides, leaving a strip of spikes running down the center of his skull. He dragged the back of his hand across his mouth, smirk fixed in place as though he knew the effect it had on those around him. The men behind him chuckled, their laughter low and humorless, the sound of jackals circling prey. Keanu rose slowly, his hand steadying Shadow with a reassuring touch. He didn't flinch under the biker's stare, nor did he return the hostility. He had learned that escalation often began in moments exactly like this, when pride demanded a response. Instead, his eyes remained calm, unreadable, his body angled slightly to shield the dog at his side. Shadow sensed the tension. The dog's hackles prickled, and his body lowered slightly into a defensive stance. A soft growl rippled in his throat, not loud but firm enough to cut through the biker's laughter. Keanu gave a small shake of the leash, grounding his companion, his voice barely above a whisper. "Easy, boy, not here." The biker leaned down slightly, eyes narrowing on Shadow. "Big dog," he muttered, voice dripping with disdain. "Bet he ain't as tough as he looks." His boots scraped forward, stopping just short of the fountain. It wasn't a kick, not yet, but the deliberate gesture sent a ripple of unease through the air. From the doorway, the waitress stiffened. She placed her tray against the wall, her eyes darting between Keanu and the gang. She knew the way these men worked, provoking, pressing, waiting for a spark to ignite. Her lips parted, and she called out softly, "Leave them alone." But her voice carried no weight here, not against the laughter that rolled out like thunder from the bar. Keanu met the biker's stare, the corner of his mouth tightening. "We're leaving," he said evenly. His tone was not submissive but final, as if the choice had already been made. He pulled gently on the leash, urging Shadow to step back from the fountain. The biker tilted his head, studying Keanu as if debating whether to push further. Then, with deliberate slowness, he smiled wider. His teeth gleamed under the sunlight, sharp and mocking. It wasn't the look of a man backing down. It was the look of someone who had marked his target and was content to wait for the right moment. As Keanu turned away, the smirk followed him. Eyes lingered on Shadow, not on the man walking him. Keanu kept his stride steady as he led Shadow away from the fountain, his boots crunching softly over grit on the sidewalk. He didn't look back, but he could feel the stairs pressing against his back, heavy as weights. Every step seemed measured against the possibility that one of the men behind him might lunge forward, that the laughter could shift into something sharper. Shadow walked close, his shoulder brushing Keanu's leg, eyes flicking between his owner and the bikers. The dog's instincts were sharp, honed by hardship before Keanu had rescued him, and now every muscle in his frame was taut. A low vibration pulsed in his throat, but Keanu's hand on the leash kept him grounded. The waitress took a small step closer, lowering her voice until only Keanu could hear. "They've been getting worse," she said, her tone hushed but urgent. "Every week it's another fight, another threat. The police don't come around here anymore. People are scared." Keanu gave her a nod of thanks, a silent acknowledgement of the courage it took to speak at all. He didn't press her with questions. He already saw enough in the hunched shoulders of pedestrians crossing the street too quickly, in the way windows along the block stayed closed even on a sweltering day. The presence of Steelfang had poisoned the area like rot in the foundation of a house. Shadow tugged slightly on the leash again, his attention pulled back to the row of motorcycles. His nose flared at the smell of grease and leather, but his body remained tense, his gaze sharp on the biker who had smirked at him moments earlier. The man was still there, leaning against the wall, arms crossed now, lips curled in that same predatory grin. His eyes never left the dog. Keanu felt the weight of the moment stretch thin, fragile as glass. The simplest move could shatter it. One shove, one kick, one careless word. Yet he also knew when to step back, to choose the path that kept Shadow safe. Without breaking stride, he murmured to his dog, "Come on, we're done here." The two of them moved on, the sound of the city resuming around them, though the echo of muffled laughter trailed behind like a shadow. What Keanu couldn't know was that the smirk lingering on the biker's face wasn't finished. It was a promise, quiet and dangerous, waiting for its moment. The cafe patio was quiet compared to the street outside. Small iron tables were scattered beneath a faded canopy, their chipped paint softened by the glow of string lights that dangled overhead. It wasn't crowded, just a few customers sipping coffee or picking at sandwiches, grateful for the shade. Keanu guided Shadow to one of the corner tables. Crouching down to remove the collapsible water bowl from his pocket, the dog wagged his tail, eager for a drink, his tongue lolling with the heat. Keanu filled the bowl carefully from a glass of cold water the waitress had left for him. The dog lapped noisily, his ears twitching at every sound, his body relaxed for the first time since they had walked past the biker bar. Keanu smiled faintly at the sight, resting one hand along Shadow's back. It was a moment of calm, a pause that felt almost ordinary in a day that had grown increasingly tense. The hum of conversation around them carried softly. An older couple discussing errands, a young man typing quickly on a laptop, the waitress moving briskly between tables. The street noise filtered in faintly, the distant thrum of motorcycles, a constant reminder of what lay just beyond the cafe walls. But here, at least for the moment, there was quiet. That quiet broke without warning. A heavy shadow cut across the patio as a tall figure stepped between the tables, boots thudding against the pavement with deliberate weight. The chatter around them faltered. Heads turned, eyes narrowing in recognition or widening in fear. The man's presence seemed to drain the air, leaving only tension in its place. Ryder. He was broad and muscular, his shaved head gleaming under the sunlight, tattoos crawling up his arms like dark vines. His leather vest bore the snarling wolf insignia of the Steel Fang Gang, patches stitched across it marking fights, rallies, and scars of violence. His eyes were sharp and cold, and the curve of his mouth carried no humor, only cruelty disguised as amusement. Keanu looked up from his crouch, meeting Ryder's gaze calmly but without warmth. He didn't move yet, not wanting to startle Shadow, who was still drinking. Ryder stopped near the edge of the table, his boots inches from the dog's flank. The pause stretched too long, the silence heavy with the anticipation of what he might do. Then it happened. Without hesitation, Ryder's boot swung sideways with brutal precision, striking Shadow in the ribs. The sound was sickening, dull and sharp at once, a thud that reverberated through the patio. Shadow yelped, his body jolting sideways as he stumbled, water spilling from the bowl across the pavement. The dog's tail clamped down, his body curling instinctively to shield himself from another blow. Gasps erupted from the cafe. A woman dropped her fork with a clatter. The older couple froze, mouths open in shock. The young man with the laptop pushed his chair back sharply, his face pale. For a heartbeat, no one moved, as if disbelief had locked the entire patio into silence. Keanu moved then, rising in one fluid motion. His chair scraped back harshly against the stone floor, the sound cutting through the stunned quiet. His body stood tall and unyielding, his face tightening into a mask of fury. His eyes, usually calm, blazed with a fire that froze Ryder in his tracks for a fraction of a second. Keanu stepped forward, placing himself between Shadow and Ryder, his stance protective and commanding. Shadow whimpered softly behind him, pressing close to his legs, trusting his owner to be the shield he needed. The cafe was still silent, every gaze locked on the two men now standing face to face. Keanu stood tall, his body angled forward, his chest expanding with every measured breath. The silence on the patio sharpened as if every sound had been cut away, leaving only the harsh rhythm of Shadow's labored breathing and the faint creak of Ryder shifting his weight. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Keanu's voice was low, steady, but laced with a fury that trembled beneath the surface. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. The strength of his tone carried across the cafe, pressing against every ear. Ryder tilted his head, smirk twisting crueler. He spat on the ground near Shadow, his boots spread wide, hands flexing at his sides. "Control your mutt," he drawled, voice rough and taunting, "or I'll put him down for you." A ripple of shock spread through the crowd. The young man with the laptop half rose from his chair as though ready to intervene, then froze when Ryder's eyes swept across him like a blade. The waitress stood rooted to the spot, tray trembling in her hands, her knuckles white from the grip. Even the older couple dared not breathe too loudly, afraid of what might follow. Keanu's hands curled into fists, then loosened. His instinct screamed to strike, to repay the cruelty instantly, but years of restraint held him steady. His first duty was Shadow. He shifted slightly, widening his stance, creating a wall between the biker and the trembling dog. One hand dropped to touch Shadow's head, grounding the animal with a reassuring stroke. Shadow's growl rumbled low, his eyes fixed on Ryder, yet he stayed in place, the leash held firm in Keanu's grip. "Shadow doesn't start fights," Keanu said, his voice quiet but edged with steel. "But he'll finish one if you push him." For the first time, Ryder's eyes flicked upward, meeting Keanu's full gaze. The smirk remained, but a flicker of recognition passed through his stare. This wasn't an ordinary man standing in his way. The stillness in Keanu's posture, the contained fury in his eyes, it unsettled him more than if the actor had shouted. But Ryder wasn't a man who backed down easily. He leaned in closer, so close the acrid smell of beer and smoke radiated off him. His sneer deepened, voice dropping low so only Keanu and those nearest could hear. "You think that leash makes you strong? Out here, strength is shown with blood." The words coiled in the air like venom, the threat deliberate, the cruelty intentional. The cafe held its breath. Every patron seemed frozen, caught between fear and outrage, waiting for the next move that would decide whether the day ended in chaos or control. Ryder's smirk lingered, daring Keanu to react, baiting him like a predator testing its prey. Keanu didn't move at first. He let the silence grow heavy, his eyes locked on Ryder's. The longer he held that gaze, the more unsettling it became. Behind him, Shadow pressed against his leg, ribs still tender from the kick, his breathing uneven. Keanu's fingers brushed once more along the dog's head, his touch firm, reassuring, telling him without words that he was safe. Finally, Keanu spoke, his voice carrying the kind of calm that was more dangerous than shouting. "You laid your hands, or your boots, on the wrong dog." The word struck harder than any raised fist. Ryder's jaw twitched, his grin faltering for the first time, but it returned quickly, broader and meaner, as if doubling down on his cruelty. He laughed, a sound devoid of joy, and turned his head just enough for his gang outside the bar to hear. The muffled roar of their amusement seeped through the open door, feeding his bravado. "Hollywood boy playing tough?" Ryder sneered, his voice pitched loud enough for everyone on the patio. "Think you're some hero? You and that mutt don't belong here." Keanu's jaw tightened. He didn't take the bait, but the anger in his eyes burned hotter, flashing like steel drawn from a sheath. His body stayed rooted, every muscle controlled, but ready. He was a wall, unshakable, unyielding. The crowd could see it, and Ryder could too. For a tense moment, neither man moved. The sun beat down, the faint hum of city traffic droned, and still the standoff held. Finally, Ryder shifted back half a step, tilting his chin upward as though claiming a hollow victory. He spat near Shadow again, the insult deliberate, then muttered with venom, "Control your mutt, or I'll put him down for you." The line hung in the air like a strike of lightning, drawing audible gasps from the onlookers. The threat was clear, vicious, and final. Keanu didn't answer. Not yet. His silence spoke more than words, his glare promising that Ryder's cruelty would not go unanswered. The patio seemed to shrink around them. Every set of eyes was fixed on the two men, the battered pit bull pressed close to his owner's leg, and the biker standing a step too near, his smirk daring a response. The hush was absolute, even the city noise fading behind the moment, as if the world itself leaned closer to listen. Keanu's jaw set. He inhaled slowly, his chest rising with the kind of composure that came from years of discipline. When he spoke, his voice was calm, measured, but as cold as steel. "You never touch my dog again." The words cut clean through the air, sharper than a shout. The crowd felt it, and Ryder did too. For a moment, the biker's smirk faltered, his eyes flicking sideways as though weighing whether this quiet man meant what he said. But just as quickly, the grin returned, wider now, plastered on with defiance. A sound rose from the doorway of the bar. The creak of boots, the scrape of leather. One by one, more men filed out, drawn by the tension. They carried their weight with the swagger of men who thrived on intimidation, their laughter already rumbling as they took in the scene. They leaned against the doorframe, against the wall, some holding bottles that clinked faintly as they tilted them in mock salute. "Well, look what we've got here," one of them jeered, voice dripping with derision. "Movie star protecting his mutt." Another barked a laugh, tossing his cigarette to the ground. Soft hands, soft voice. "You think he's gonna fight us?" Their mockery spread, rolling over the patio like dark water. Patrons shrank back in their chairs, eyes darting nervously between the gang and Keanu. The waitress who had warned him earlier pressed a hand to her mouth, fear bright in her eyes. She had seen this before, and she knew where it usually led. Shadow shifted, his body low, ears back, a low growl rippling in his throat. It wasn't loud, but it was steady, and it silenced the nearest biker who had started to step closer. The sound wasn't the bark of a frightened animal. It was a warning, deep and primal, the voice of loyalty ready to defend. Keanu reached down, brushing his hand along Shadow's back to keep him grounded. The gesture was protective, but it was also a show of control. He wanted them to see it, that his dog's strength came not from rage, but from discipline. Ryder laughed. It was loud, ugly, rolling from his chest, as if mocking not only Keanu, but the bond between man and dog. He leaned forward, close enough that his breath carried the stench of smoke and cheap liquor. "You're nothing but a soft Hollywood boy," he sneered, voice pitched for everyone to hear. "Hiding behind a mutt like that." The laughter of the others swelled, louder now, feeding off Ryder's contempt. The sound pressed in on the patio, oppressive and cruel. Yet Keanu did not flinch. He stood firm, eyes locked on Ryder, silence his weapon, calm his armor. The tension pressed like a storm about to break. The bikers spread out around the patio, their boots scraping against the concrete, their leather vests creaking as they shifted into positions meant to box Keanu in. Their grins widened, their jeers sharper. A few patrons quietly slipped back inside the cafe, hoping to avoid being caught in what felt like an inevitable clash. Others remained frozen, too shocked or too fearful to move. Ryder stepped closer, shoulders squared, the wolf insignia on his vest catching the light. His smirk was one of arrogance, but beneath it his jaw tightened. Keanu's silence had unsettled him more than he cared to admit. He was used to provoking outbursts, to seeing fear or rage explode instantly. But here was a man who stood calm, every movement measured, every breath controlled. It made Ryder want to push harder. "You really think that calm voice scares me?" Ryder sneered. "This is our street. That mutt of yours doesn't belong here." "Neither do you." Keanu let the words pass without reaction. Instead, he adjusted his stance, one step forward so that his body shielded Shadow entirely. His hand remained low, fingers brushing Shadow's fur in a way that steadied them both. The pit bull's growl grew a shade deeper, but he didn't lunge. The leash was firm, the connection between man and dog strong enough to hold steady even under this pressure. The bikers laughed again, but their eyes flicked uneasily at the dog's composure. He wasn't snapping wildly or barking without control. He was watching, waiting, every muscle coiled. It was the kind of discipline that hinted at training and loyalty far beyond their assumptions. A bottle shattered suddenly against the wall, tossed by one of the gang members. The sharp crack jolted the air, causing several cafe patrons to cry out. Ryder grinned wider at the reaction, relishing the fear. But Keanu didn't move. His jaw remained tight, his stare locked forward, his voice ready. "You mistake kindness for weakness," he said finally, his tone calm but sharp as a blade. "Shadow isn't here to fight, but if you touch him again, I will not let it pass." The quiet words silenced even the bikers for a heartbeat. The waitress gasped softly, her eyes darting to Ryder as if praying the man would hear the warning. Ryder, though, only chuckled after that beat, shaking his head as though amused. He turned toward his crew, lifting his arms in mock presentation. "Listen to him," he said loudly, pointing at Keanu. "He thinks he's got rules for us. He thinks a movie star can tell us what to do." The bikers roared with laughter, the sound echoing off the narrow street. But under the noise, the tension remained. They had seen something in Keanu's stillness, something that didn't quite fit the image they'd tried to paint of him. It unnerved them, though none of them would admit it. The laughter rolled on, but its edges were brittle, like glass ready to crack. Ryder's grin held steady, though his eyes betrayed the flicker of calculation. He wanted to humiliate, to provoke, to leave Keanu broken in front of his men, yet something in the way Keanu stood, the calm, the restraint, the unwavering focus, made Ryder hesitate. Keanu did not back away. His voice was level, quiet enough that only those closest could hear, but cold enough to chill the air around them. "You don't scare me, and you will never lay a hand on my dog again." The words cut through the mockery, striking deeper than Ryder expected. For a moment, the gang behind him shuffled, exchanging glances. It wasn't fear exactly, but unease, the kind of ripple that spread when they realized the man in front of them wasn't playing their game. Shadow held his ground, body pressed to Keanu's leg, growl steady like a drumbeat. His amber eyes tracked Ryder's every movement, his loyalty etched into every line of his posture. The dog was hurt, his ribs still tender, but his spirit had not bent. The sight of him only deepened Keanu's resolve. Ryder leaned closer, his face inches from Keanu's. The stench of smoke and stale alcohol clung to his words. "You think this ends here? You think a calm voice and a mutt make you strong?" His smile widened, but it no longer reached his eyes. "You'll regret this." The threat hung heavy, colder than the laughter that had filled the air minutes before. Ryder straightened slowly, tilting his chin upward, and with a sharp nod he signaled to his men. The bikers jeered once more, but their taunts were thinner now, less certain, as they followed Ryder back toward the bar. Boots clattered against the concrete, leather vests brushing each other as they disappeared into the doorway. The patio released a collective breath. Chairs scraped as people shifted, murmurs rising cautiously. The waitress set her tray down with trembling hands, relief mixing with fear. She looked at Keanu, her voice barely steady. "They don't usually walk away." Keanu didn't answer right away. He crouched instead, running his hand along Shadow's head, checking his side gently. The dog winced but stayed calm, pressing into the touch with trust. Keanu exhaled, his jaw still tight. Only then did he look back toward the dark doorway of the bar, where Ryder's smirk had vanished into the shadows. "They're not done," he said quietly, more to himself than anyone else. And neither am I. The patio slowly settled after the gang's departure, but the tension lingered like smoke. Keanu remained crouched by Shadow, running his hand gently along the dog's ribs. The tender flinch beneath his touch confirmed what he already feared. The kick had left its mark. But Shadow lifted his head, eyes steady, tail giving a weak wag as if to say he was still ready to stand by his side. That resilience brought the faintest curve to Keanu's lips. The waitress, her nerves still showing, approached the table carefully. She placed a glass of water down with a trembling hand. I'm sorry you had to deal with that," she murmured. "They've been a menace for too long." Keanu gave her a reassuring nod. "It isn't your fault. Thank you for the water." She managed a small smile and hurried back inside. Keanu pulled his chair closer to Shadow, settling down again. He needed to ease the weight of what had just happened, for himself and for his dog. Raising his hand, he caught the eye of another waitress coming onto the patio. A woman in her 30s with dark hair pulled into a loose bun. Her name tag read Elena. She carried herself differently from the others, her expression warm even as she noticed Shadow resting against Keanu's leg. "Well, aren't you handsome?" she said softly, crouching a little so she wasn't looming over the dog. "What's his name?" "Shadow," Keanu replied. Elena extended her hand carefully. Shadow sniffed, then gave her fingers a gentle lick, his tail thumping weakly. Elena chuckled. "Sweetheart. Kinder than most of the people I serve. That's for sure." Her lightness helped melt the tension. Keanu allowed himself a breath, shoulders relaxing slightly. "He's been through a lot," he said. "But he's loyal, always gentle unless someone gives him a reason not to be." "Well," Elena said with a smile, "he deserves something good then. Can I get you both something to eat?" Keanu glanced down at Shadow, then back to her. "A steak sandwich for me, and could you bring him a plain piece of steak, no seasoning?" "Of course." She scribbled the order quickly. "The kitchen will be happy to cook something up for him. He deserves it after a day like this." When she left, Keanu leaned down, brushing his hand through Shadow's fur. "Food's coming, buddy. You'll feel better." The dog gave a small huff of acknowledgement, resting his head on his paws. For a moment, Keanu allowed himself to believe the worst was behind them. The bikers had retreated, Shadow was still on his feet, and soon they would eat. He rose briefly, telling Shadow to stay, and stepped toward the cafe's entrance to wash his hands. Behind him, Elena knelt beside the dog again, murmuring kind words. Shadow licked at her fingers and wagged his tail, soaking in the gentle attention. Neither of them noticed the man who slipped quietly past the edge of the patio, his leather vest hidden beneath a worn jacket, his face shadowed by a low cap. He carried himself with the swagger of someone who belonged, yet made sure to avoid Keanu's gaze. In his hand, wrapped in greasy paper, was a thick sausage. The disguised biker moved with practiced ease, blending into the casual rhythm of the cafe crowd. To the untrained eye, he was just another passerby cutting through the tables, but his eyes betrayed him. Hard, focused, never leaving the dog resting under the shade of the canopy. Shadow lifted his head, ears pricking slightly, but Elena's calm voice kept him settled. It had been a while since— "Good boy," she whispered, stroking his head. "Your owner will be right back." The biker crouched as though adjusting his jacket, but his hand slipped quickly into the greasy paper. With a subtle flick of his wrist, he tore off a piece of the sausage, its scent sharp with hidden toxins masked beneath the fat and spices. He held it low, just within the dog's reach. Shadow hesitated. His nose twitched, sniffing at the offering. For a moment, his amber eyes flicked toward the man, uncertain. But the smell of food was strong, and hunger after a long morning made him inch forward. Elena glanced away for only a second as she adjusted her apron, and, in that breath of time, Shadow accepted the morsel. His jaws closed. the meat swallowed before she even realized what had happened. The biker stood smoothly, brushing off his hands as though nothing had occurred. He gave a low whistle, tipping his cap down further, and slipped back toward the street. The act was quick, deliberate, and untraceable. By the time Elaine looked back, the man was already gone. Shadow licked his lips, tail wagging faintly, as if pleased by the unexpected treat. Elena frowned, her brow furrowing. "Where did you get that, boy?" she murmured, scanning the ground but seeing no scraps. She shook her head and smiled, deciding it was nothing. Inside the cafe, Keanu rinsed his hands at the sink, unaware of what had transpired outside. He thought about Shadow's resilience, the way the dog had stood beside him even after the kick, and felt a swell of gratitude. When he straightened, he caught his reflection in the mirror. Tired eyes, jaw tight, but steadiness still there. He promised himself again that no one would harm Shadow without answering for it. Back on the patio, Elena rose as the kitchen bell rang, signaling that their order was ready. She called into the doorway for the plate, then returned to pat Shadow once more before stepping inside. The pit bull shifted slightly, licking his muzzle again, tail thumping faintly against the ground. Nothing yet betrayed what had been slipped into his system. The minutes stretched. Keanu made his way back through the doorway, adjusting his jacket as he stepped outside. He gave Elena a nod of thanks as she hurried past with a tray for another table, then returned his attention to Shadow. The dog wagged his tail, but shifted oddly on his paws, his body trembling almost imperceptibly. Keanu crouched, concern flashing in his eyes. "What's wrong, boy?" he murmured, brushing a hand along Shadow's back. The dog leaned against him, steadying himself. The faint tremor worsened. Keanu sat at the edge of the long wooden table, fingers steepled, his eyes fixed on the bank's letter. The dim lamp above him hummed softly, throwing a circle of yellow light across the room. His mother stood nearby, shoulders tense but voice calm, explaining how the hotel management had refused her stay, how they had looked at her with quiet disdain, before dismissing her with a smirk. She'd tried to downplay it, but the way her hand lingered against her chest betrayed the wound. Keanu listened in silence. Inside, though, there was a storm. He had faced rejection in his career, had been overlooked countless times, but this was different. This was his mother, a woman who had raised him through hardship, who had sacrificed her own comfort so that he could pursue his dreams. To see her humiliated, and for no reason other than pride and prejudice, was intolerable. She paused, searching for words, then placed her hand over his. "Keanu, let it go. These things happen. We endure, we move forward." He looked up at her, the weight of unspoken history in his eyes. "Mom, they don't get to treat you that way. Not after everything you've done, everything you've survived. This isn't about pride, it's about dignity." For a long moment the two of them sat in stillness. She searched his face, recognizing the resolve she'd seen when he was younger, when he refused to give up acting despite endless rejections, when he stood beside his sister through her illness, when he chose compassion over anger time and time again. That same resolve now burned brighter, sharper, fueled by love. Finally, he rose from the chair. He slipped the letter into his jacket pocket, as though sealing a decision inside him. "If they won't respect you as a guest," he said softly, "then I'll make sure they respect you as the owner." The words hung in the air, almost unreal. His mother blinked, stunned. "Keanu, you can't mean—" "I do," he interrupted gently. "Money isn't what matters to me, but what I do with it. That's where meaning lives. They denied you shelter, Mom. That ends tomorrow." She shook her head, torn between disbelief and fear for what such a move would unleash. "It's too much. You don't need to carry this burden." He smiled faintly, a tenderness in his expression that softened the steel beneath. It's not a burden, it's a promise. Outside, the night deepened, the city pulsing with its indifferent rhythm. Inside, in that small room, a decision had been forged. A vow that was not just about a hotel, but about rewriting the terms of dignity itself. Keanu kissed his mother's forehead, his voice low but steady. Get some rest. Tomorrow, things change. And as he stepped away into the shadows of the hallway, the quiet resolve in his stride carried the weight of a man who would not simply retaliate, but transform humiliation into a legacy of justice. Shadow's body gave a sudden, violent shudder that sent Keanu's heart into his throat. One moment the dog was steadying himself against his side. The next, his legs buckled beneath him. His chest heaved in sharp, ragged bursts, as if the very air had turned against him. A pained whimper broke from Shadow's throat, thin and desperate, a sound that cut deeper than any blade. Keanu dropped instantly to the ground, his knees scraping the stone of the cafe patio, but he didn't care. "Shadow, easy boy, stay with me," he whispered, his voice trembling though he tried to steady it. His hands swept along the pit bull's trembling body, trying to find the cause, searching for some injury unseen. But there was no wound, no visible mark, only the terrible weakness spreading through Shadow's frame. Around them, the chatter of the cafe dissolved into panicked murmurs. Chairs scraped, cups clattered, and faces turned with wide-eyed alarm. Elena, rushing back from the counter with a tray, froze in place. The tray slipped from her hands, glasses shattering on the ground, but she didn't notice. Her gaze locked on the sight of the loyal animal gasping for air. "Water, please, I need water!" Keanu's voice cut sharp through the confusion. His hands cupped beneath Shadow's head, lifting gently as the dog's body convulsed. His eyes darted desperately around the tables until another waitress, shaken but quick, scrambled forward with a bottle. Keanu tore the cap free and cradled Shadow's jaw, tilting his head to coax the liquid down. "Come on, Shadow, you can do this. Drink for me." The water spilled, some dribbling across the dog's lips, some catching in his throat. Shadow gagged, fought, then managed a swallow. Relief flickered in Keanu's chest for a fleeting second, only for terror to replace it as the dog coughed and collapsed, limper than before. Elena rushed forward, eyes wide with dawning horror. "That man," she gasped, clutching her apron in her fists. "That man with the gloves. I saw him. He fed your dog something. Oh God, I thought it was nothing. He poisoned him." Her words slammed into Keanu like a hammer, each syllable confirming what his heart already feared. His head snapped up, scanning the street, searching for the figure she described. But the crowd outside the cafe was already shifting, oblivious, and the faceless biker was gone. Keanu's chest tightened, fury and dread twining together until he could hardly breathe. "No, no, no," he muttered, his voice breaking as he turned back to Shadow. He stroked the dog's ears, pressed his forehead against his fur, desperate to anchor him to life. Shadow's breaths were shallow now, each one a battle, each one weaker than the last. The patio had fallen silent. Patrons stood frozen, helpless witnesses to the unfolding nightmare. Someone muttered, "Is he dying?" The words cut like a knife, and Keanu snapped, "No! He's not dying. Not today. Not here." Shadow whimpered once more, his tail twitching, then falling limp against the stone floor. Keanu felt the weight of it, like a lead anchor in his chest. With a sharp inhale, resolve ignited in his eyes. He slid his arms beneath Shadow's heavy body, lifting him against his chest. The dog's weight was solid, straining, but Keanu didn't falter. He rose to his feet, jaw clenched, every line of his body radiating determination. Without another word, without waiting for help, he turned and began to run. Through the crowd, through the noise, through the choking fear that threatened to drown him. Somewhere out there had to be a clinic, a chance, a hope. And he would carry Shadow there with his own strength if that was what it took. The diner had emptied out by then, save for the cook humming softly behind the counter. and a lone trucker sipping black coffee in the corner. Keanu sat across from Elena, his fingers tracing the edge of his cup. The storm outside had slowed, the rain tapping gently against the glass, but inside, the tension had only grown sharper, more fragile. Elena took a breath, her eyes glistening as she met his. When I left, I told myself it was for survival. That if I didn't run, I'd drown in all the weight of it. The lies, the debts, the shame. Her voice cracked, and she gripped the edge of the table. But survival turned into silence, and silence turned into years. Keanu leaned forward, his voice low but steady. I wasn't looking for perfection. I was just looking for honesty. If you had told me back then, if you had just said the truth. He stopped, shaking his head, as though the words were too heavy to carry further. I was scared, she whispered, the words spilling like a confession. Scared that if I told you who the father was, you'd see me differently, that you'd stop seeing the girl you once trusted, and I couldn't bear losing that. His hand tightened around the cup, the porcelain squeaking faintly under his grip. But in hiding it, you lost me anyway. The ache in his tone silenced her. For a moment, only the rain answered, her shoulders curled inward, as though bracing against a blow she'd long feared. Finally, Keanu's gaze softened, though his eyes were shadowed with exhaustion. I can't change the past, neither can you. But this, he gestured lightly between them, this is the moment we decide what happens next. We either keep running from it, or we face it together. Elena blinked back tears, her throat tight. For the first time in years, she saw not just the man she once loved, but the man who still carried her secret like a wound he never asked for. I don't want to run anymore, she said, her voice trembling yet clear. Keanu nodded slowly, the faintest trace of something, pain, hope, maybe both, flickering across his face. The room seemed to expand with every second of silence, as if the very walls held their breath alongside those present. Evelyn's eyes glistened, her lips parting but no words coming. She had never expected to hear his name again, let alone from her son. The memories she had worked so hard to bury now clawed their way back to the surface, demanding to be acknowledged. Keanu's voice softened, but it didn't waver. I don't say this to reopen old wounds. I say it because, if I've learned anything from life, it's that running from the truth only deepens the scars. And I don't want us to carry this weight alone anymore. His mother's hands trembled as she clasped them tightly on her lap, a gesture that betrayed both strength and fragility. She nodded slowly, as if conceding to something far greater than herself. You have his courage, she whispered, and his stubbornness. I see it every day in you. For the first time, Keanu noticed the mixture of pride and regret etched across her face. It was a look he had missed before, buried beneath years of quiet resilience. She wasn't just his mother. She was a woman who had carried her own battles in silence. Evelyn reached across the table, her fingers brushing the back of his hand. If you're ready to face these truths, then I'll stand with you. But you must understand, some memories may not bring comfort. Some may bring more pain. Keanu met her gaze with steady resolve. Then let's face that pain together. It's better than pretending it never existed. The air shifted, a fragile but undeniable bond forming in that shared promise. For once, the ghosts of the past felt less like tormentors and more like companions, guiding them toward honesty. Evelyn exhaled, her shoulders relaxing for the first time in years. Then it begins here, tonight. No more secrets between us. Keanu squeezed her hand gently, his own heart lighter than it had been in decades. The storm outside had quieted, leaving only the patter of rain against the window. And in that quiet, a new chapter opened. Not of denial or silence, but of courage and truth. The street exploded into noise and chaos the moment Keanu bolted from the cafe doors, shadow limp in his arms. Car horns blared as he dashed off the curb without hesitation, weaving between streams of traffic that seemed determined to block his way. A taxi screeched, its brakes shrieking, the driver's curses following him down the avenue. None of it registered. His entire world had narrowed to the desperate weight in his arms, the shallow, weakening breaths of the animal who trusted him completely. Shadow's head lolled against his chest, his body trembling with every uneven gasp. Keanu's heart thundered, his muscles straining as adrenaline surged through every vein. He whispered hoarsely against Shadow's ear, a plea he repeated with each step. "Hold on, boy. Just hold on. I've got you." The sidewalks were crowded, pedestrians stopping in their tracks as they saw the scene unfold. Murmurs rose in confusion, some pointing, others stepping aside as Keanu barreled past. His legs ached, but he couldn't afford to slow down. Every second mattered. Every heartbeat in Shadow's chest counted. He tried to calculate the distance in his mind. 3 blocks to the clinic. It might as well have been 100. The streets stretched endlessly before him, every intersection another obstacle, every traffic light another barrier he couldn't acknowledge. He darted into the crosswalk, ignoring the red signal, a bus grazing so close that the rush of wind stung his face. The driver's horn blared, but Keanu never looked back. His guilt pressed heavier than Shadow's weight. He had left him for a minute, just 1 minute, thinking he was safe in plain sight. That mistake clawed at his chest as fiercely as his lungs burned from running. He should have known better. He should never have trusted the quiet. Now the cost of his carelessness might be the life of the one companion who never asked for more than love. The roar of motorcycles echoed faintly in the distance, or perhaps it was only his imagination, feeding the fire of panic in his chest. Ryder's sneer replayed in his mind like a haunting refrain. "You'll regret this." Keanu cursed under his breath, pressing Shadow tighter against him, as if to shield him from the memory itself. Shadow whimpered, the sound so faint it was nearly lost to the city noise, yet it tore Keanu apart more brutally than any insult or wound ever had. "Stay with me," he urged, his throat tight, his voice breaking. "We're almost there, I promise." His feet pounded against the concrete, sweat soaking through his shirt, his arms burning but refusing to yield. A woman gasped as he shoved past her on the corner, her coffee spilling across the pavement. A group of teenagers stepped aside, their laughter silenced by the urgency in his eyes. To them, he wasn't the actor they recognized from billboards. He was just a man on the edge of losing what mattered most. 2 blocks. His lungs screamed, his vision blurred with sweat, but he refused to falter. His mind played tricks, offering images of Shadow as he had been just hours ago, tongue lolling, tail wagging, bounding with joy at every kind word. The contrast to the trembling body in his arms was unbearable. He bit down on the surge of emotion threatening to paralyze him. He couldn't afford grief yet. Grief was for after. For now, there was only motion. The neon cross of the veterinary clinic flickered in the distance, a beacon through the haze of panic. His heart surged, his legs pumping harder, every stride pulled by the hope that salvation was still within reach. The courtroom quieted to an unnatural stillness, every breath suspended as the lawyer pressed forward, emboldened by his earlier laughter. He circled like a predator, pacing slowly, tapping his pen against the lectern. "Tell us, Mr. Reeves, what qualifies an actor? Someone who plays pretend for a living? To lecture this court on matters of law?" His smirk deepened as if he had finally cornered his prey. Keanu did not flinch. He leaned slightly forward, eyes steady, voice calm. "Pretending, as you call it, demands empathy. To embody a character, you must step outside of yourself, understand perspectives that are not your own. Isn't that the very essence of justice? to weigh another person's experience, to see beyond your own bias? Murmurs rippled across the audience. The lawyer's smirk faltered, just for a heartbeat, but his pride would not allow retreat. Empathy is not law, Mr. Reeve. Facts and precedent are. Keanu nodded slowly. And yet, what are facts without context? What is precedent without humanity? The law was written to serve people, not to diminish them. He paused, letting the silence stretch, letting his words land where no statute could reach. The judge's eyes lifted from her notes. Something in Keanu's tone had pierced through the legal jargon and struck at the marrow of truth. The jury leaned forward instinctively, as if pulled by a gravity larger than the trial itself. The lawyer tried again, desperation creeping into his tone. So you think Hollywood philosophy should dictate justice? Keanu's gaze softened, his voice quiet but unyielding. I think justice demands courage. Courage to see the person behind the accusation, the humanity within the law. If we lose that, we've lost everything. A silence so profound followed that the air itself seemed to hold its breath. Even those who had laughed earlier now sat frozen, confronted with an undeniable sincerity. The lawyer's pen tapped once, then stilled. For the first time, his confidence wavered. Across the courtroom, eyes turned not to him, but to Keanu, the man they had mocked, now commanding the space without raising his voice, without force, only with truth. And that was when the tide truly began to shift. Keanu stood silent as the laughter faded, the courtroom's energy collapsing into a hush. The judge had expected him to fumble, to shrink under the glare of cynicism. But Keanu's composure unsettled everyone. He reached for a small folder resting neatly on the defense table, opening it with steady hands. Inside were documents, contracts, and a faded letter, evidence not yet revealed. As he placed the papers on the podium, his voice carried with a measured calm that cut through the room. This isn't just about what the law allows, he said, looking directly at the judge. It's about what justice demands. The audience leaned forward. The once dismissive journalist scribbled with renewed urgency. Even the opposing lawyer shifted uncomfortably, as though realizing the ground beneath them was about to break. Keanu lifted the letter, reading aloud words written years ago, words from a man wrongfully accused, who had begged for someone to believe him. His tone trembled, not from fear, but from the weight of truth. Each sentence painted a picture of broken promises, hidden corruption, and lives destroyed in silence. The courtroom transformed. No one was laughing now. The letter's simple honesty, paired with Keanu's quiet conviction, struck deeper than legal jargon ever could. When he finished, he folded the page with care and placed it back into the folder. His eyes never left the judge. We're not here to entertain. We're here to restore dignity to those who were denied it. That is the purpose of this court. The silence afterward felt like a held breath, as though the entire room waited for permission to exhale. The judge, who had moments before worn a smirk, now looked unsettled, his pen frozen above his notes. In the gallery, someone whispered, "He's right." Another voice followed, firmer this time. "Why are we laughing? This is serious." The ripple grew until the weight of Keanu's words anchored the room in solemn clarity. The shift was undeniable. Where mockery had thrived, respect now grew. Keanu hadn't raised his voice, hadn't fought fire with fire. He had simply stood his ground, wielding truth with a humility no one could mock. And in that moment, the entire court realized something startling. The man they had laughed at was the only one taking justice seriously. The glass doors of the veterinary clinic burst open as Keanu rushed inside, shadow heavy in his arms. His voice cracked as he shouted for help, desperation carrying louder than any script he had ever read. The sterile lights above flickered across the pale linoleum floors, the scent of antiseptic filling the air. A nurse at the reception desk jumped up at the sound of his plea, her eyes widening as she saw the limp dog gasping weakly in his arms. "Back here now," she cried, pointing him toward a swinging door. A team was already moving, pulling a gurney into the hall. Keanu laid Shadow down as gently as his shaking arms would allow, but the dog's chest barely rose. His tongue lolled to the side, his eyes unfocused, and his tail no longer moved. From the back of the clinic, a woman in her late 30s approached with steady strides. Her dark hair was tied back neatly, her eyes sharp yet calm in the face of the chaos. Her name tag read, Dr. Harper, and her voice carried authority. "What happened?" she demanded. "Helmuth was poisoned," Keanu said, breathless, the words breaking in his throat. "Someone gave him something at the cafe. He just collapsed." His hands hovered near Shadow, trembling with the fear that touching him might make it worse. Dr. Harper's expression tightened, but she didn't waste time with shock. "Get activated charcoal. Start an IV line. Oxygen mask ready," she ordered. Nurses sprang into motion. Tubes were uncoiled, fluids prepared, syringes filled with practiced speed. Keanu could only step back as Shadow was surrounded by hands and equipment, the flurry of medical urgency pushing him further toward the door. "Stay here," Dr. Harper told him firmly as she bent over Shadow. "We'll do everything we can. You need to let us work." Keanu opened his mouth to argue, but the steel in her tone left no room. He backed away slowly, his fists clenched so tightly his knuckles turned white. The door shut, and the sound of voices, machines, and urgent instructions muffled behind it. He found himself in the waiting area, the silence of the lobby a cruel contrast to the storm inside. Keanu dropped into a chair, his body sagging under the weight of helplessness. His chest heaved, his head fell into his hands, and for the first time in years he felt utterly powerless. He had faced villains on screen, stared down men with weapons, performed stunts that had left him bruised and battered, but none of that compared to the sight of his dog lying motionless on a steel table. His mind betrayed him with memories. A flash of Shadow's first day at the shelter years ago came unbidden. Keanu had walked past rows of barking cages, animals pressing against the bars, each one desperate for freedom. In the far corner, quiet and still, sat a gray pit bull with amber eyes that seemed too tired for his young age. The dog hadn't barked, hadn't begged for attention. He had simply watched, his gaze weary but filled with a strange dignity. Keanu had stopped in front of the cage, something pulling at his chest. The shelter worker had shaken her head. "That one? He's been here the longest. People overlook him. Too many scars, too many assumptions. He's gentle, but most don't want to take the chance." Kneeling by the bars, Keanu had reached out, speaking softly. The dog had hesitated, then pressed his nose through the gap, as if testing whether this human was different. In that instant, Keanu knew. "I'll take him," he had said, his voice sure. The bond had been instant. Shadow, as Keanu named him, followed at his heel without hesitation. On long walks through quiet streets, on nights when the world outside felt too sharp, Shadow's presence grounded him. The dog had slept by his bed, sat beside him during script readings, and given him the silent loyalty no amount of fame could buy. Shadow was more than a pet. He was family. Now that bond felt like it was slipping through his fingers, poisoned by the cruelty of a stranger. Keanu clenched his fists tighter, his body trembling. Guilt gnawed at him, bitter and merciless. If he hadn't stepped away, if he had stayed by Shadow's side, none of this would have happened. He had promised to protect him, and in the single moment he looked away, his friend had suffered. Every second in the waiting room stretched like an hour. The ticking clock above the reception desk beat against his ears, cruel in its indifference. Footsteps passed behind the closed doors, muffled voices rising and falling, machines beeping faintly. Keanu stared at the door as if he could will it to open with good news. But deep down, he feared the worst. Keanu looked down at the photograph again, running his thumb over the faded edges. "I don't remember him ever holding me," he said quietly. His voice was steady, but the weight beneath it was undeniable. The room seemed to absorb the silence, as though the walls themselves were listening. Samuel placed a gentle hand on Keanu's shoulder. He was a hard man to love, but he wasn't incapable. That picture, it's proof. Even in his brokenness, he tried. For the first time, Keanu let the thoughts settle without resistance. Memories of a childhood filled with absence pressed against the image of his father's arms around him, a contradiction that made his chest ache. He whispered, almost to himself, "Maybe I've been carrying only half the truth." Linda nodded softly. Sometimes forgiveness starts with recognizing there was more to the story than we were allowed to see. Keanu closed the album, his hand lingering on the cover. His face reflected a mixture of sorrow and fragile hope. For years, he had believed his father left nothing behind but pain. Now, he was beginning to see something else. Traces of love, however imperfect. Keanu closed the notebook softly, the weight of Isabella's words still settling in his heart. His mother's hand found his, trembling yet sure. Together, they understood this was not just history, but a living inheritance of love, sacrifice, and resilience. And their journey through the house had only just begun. The waiting room smelled of antiseptic and faint traces of fear. Keanu sat hunched forward on a hard plastic chair, his elbows pressed into his knees, his hands clasped together so tightly that his knuckles had turned white. Beyond the closed door, Shadow was fighting for his life, under Dr. Harper's care. The muffled sounds of medical equipment, the soft beeping of monitors, the hurried footsteps, the sharp instructions of the veterinary staff filtered faintly into the corridor, each noise carving deeper into Keanu's nerves. He pressed the heels of his palms against his eyes, forcing himself to breathe slowly, but his chest tightened all the same. Every second stretched into an eternity. He had faced countless moments of pressure in his career, film sets that demanded impossible feats, interviews that dissected his every word, personal losses that hollowed him out. But this was different. This was not about image or reputation. This was about Shadow, his dog, his companion, the one creature who had shown him a love so loyal it had anchored him through some of his darkest days. The thought of losing him because of some cruel stranger's act made his body tremble. Finally, unable to stay still, Keanu rose from his chair and pushed open the glass doors leading outside. The late afternoon air rushed against his face, heavy with the hum of the city. He sucked in a breath, hoping the openness would give him the space to release the pressure coiled in his chest. Instead, it delivered something else. Across the street, leaning casually against their bikes as though they had all the time in the world, stood Ryder and his gang. Their leather jackets gleamed under the dimming sunlight, each adorned with the jagged insignia of the Steel Fang crew. They weren't trying to hide. In fact, their entire presence screamed that they wanted to be seen. Ryder was at the center, his boots planted wide, arms folded, a cigarette burning between his lips. His eyes locked on Keanu the moment he stepped outside, a slow smirk spreading across his scarred face. "Look who it is," Ryder drawled, loudly enough for his voice to carry across the street. He flicked the ash from his cigarette and tilted his chin upward. "Hollywood himself, out here playing dog daddy." His gang laughed in unison, the sound grating, rehearsed, like jackals circling their prey. Keanu's fists curled at his sides. He forced himself to remain still, even as his blood heated at the sound of Ryder's voice. He knew their game. They wanted him to break, to charge across the street, to give them the excuse to drag this fight further into chaos. But he wouldn't. Not here, not now, not while Shadow's life hung by a thread inside the clinic. Ryder took a step forward, his smirk darkening into something uglier. "How's the mutt doing?" he asked, his voice dripping with false concern. "I heard poison works fast." "Be a real shame if he didn't make it." "Wouldn't it?" His words slithered through the air like venom, deliberate and cruel. Keanu's jaw tightened. He could almost feel the snap of Ryder's ribs under his fists, the satisfying silence that would follow if he let his rage consume him. But then, behind his anger, the memory of Shadow's weak whimper surfaced, pulling him back. If he lost himself to violence, he would be no different from them. And Shadow needed him clear, steady, alive with resolve, not clouded by vengeance. The gang laughed again, but Ryder didn't break eye contact. "You think you scare me, Reeves? You're just a man with a dog, and that dog," he paused, exhaling smoke into the air, "isn't going to be around much longer." Keanu inhaled sharply, every muscle in his body vibrating with the need to move. Instead, he anchored his boots to the ground, focusing on the cool air entering his lungs. This wasn't the place. Not yet. He had to be smarter. Shadow's survival came first. He leaned forward slightly, his voice low, calm but edged with steel. "You should leave," he said. The simplicity of the words carried a weight that caused Ryder's smirk to falter for the briefest of moments. Then it returned, sharper, mocking. "We'll leave when we're ready," Ryder shot back, his gang echoing his bravado with hollers and whistles. They straddled their bikes, revving the engines until the growl echoed against the buildings, drowning out the city noise. Ryder lifted his hand in a mock salute, his eyes glinting with malice. "Enjoy the waiting, Hollywood. Every second you sit in there wondering if your mutt lives or dies, that's the price you pay for crossing us." The gang roared with laughter again before Ryder yanked his throttle. The bikes tore down the street, engines screaming, the stench of exhaust fumes trailing behind them. Keanu stood motionless, fists trembling, his heart hammering in his chest. As the sound faded, the street grew still again. But the weight of Ryder's words lingered, pressing into Keanu's thoughts like a bruise. He unclenched his fists slowly, one finger at a time, forcing himself to remember what mattered. Shadow was still inside, still fighting. Justice would come, but it had to come on his terms, not Ryder's. He turned back toward the clinic, his face carved with determination. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The morning sun filtered through the blinds of Keanu's home, but it did nothing to brighten the storm inside him. Reporters camped outside, drones hovering, headlines screaming betrayal and scandal. He turned on the television only to see his own weary face replayed endlessly, spliced with fragments of old interviews, twisted into narratives he never intended. Every smile, every silence was dissected. Every word about love, loyalty, or faith was now painted with irony. He muted the screen, but the noise echoed in his chest, a reminder that this was no longer his fight alone. It had become the world's. Paparazzi lenses glittered like weapons as he stepped outside, shoulders squared but eyes heavy. The frenzy wasn't just about him anymore. It was about her, about their shared past dragged into spectacle. Keanu drew a steady breath, knowing silence would no longer protect anyone. A response was inevitable. The afternoon sun slanted low over the street, casting long shadows across the cracked pavement. Keanu walked with steady purpose, Shadow close at his side, though the dog still moved gingerly, recovering from the poison scare. Every step reminded him of how close he had come to losing his companion, and how dangerous Ryder's men truly were. But grief had turned into determination. He was no longer satisfied with suspicion. He needed proof. Elena stood on her porch, folding laundry into a wicker basket. She spotted Keanu approaching and set the basket aside, her eyes narrowing with both sympathy and fear. Keanu greeted her quietly, careful not to alarm her. He asked if they could talk about the night Shadow fell sick. For a moment, hesitation flickered across her face. Then she sighed and motioned for him to sit. She lowered her voice, as though even the wind might carry her words back to Ryder. She explained that she had seen two men from Ryder's gang loitering near Keanu's yard that evening. One of them carried something in his hand. At first she thought it was just food, then she realized it was a string of sausages, unnaturally shiny under the porch light, like they had been treated with something. Moments later, Shadow had been howling in pain. Keanu felt a chill course through him, though he kept his voice calm. He asked if she would be willing to repeat that statement on camera. She hesitated again, wringing her hands, then finally nodded. She knew it was dangerous, but she also knew Ryder had gone too far. Keanu pulled out his phone, pressed record, and asked her to recount what she had just told him. Elena's voice trembled, but she spoke clearly, her eyes darting nervously toward the street. When she finished, Keanu thanked her, promising he would keep her safe. As he left Elena's porch, another neighbor approached him. This one was a middle-aged man with grease on his hands and a wrench tucked into his belt. His name was Victor, and he owned the small auto repair shop at the corner. He had overheard part of Keanu's conversation and decided it was time to speak up. He told Keanu that Ryder's crew had been tormenting the neighborhood for months. They had slashed tires, broken windows, and demanded protection money from small business owners like him. Most people stayed silent out of fear, but Victor was tired of the silence. Keanu listened carefully, recording Victor's words as well. Victor described specific nights, the men who showed up, the threats they made. His voice was steady, but beneath it, years of anger simmered. He said Ryder wasn't just a bully. He was building a reign of fear. If no one stopped him, the gang would only grow bolder. Keanu ended the recording and met Victor's eyes. He told him that what he was doing mattered, that standing up together gave them a chance. Victor nodded, but his jaw clenched. He knew there would be consequences. Still, he was willing to take that risk. For Keanu, each testimony added weight to his growing case. But deep down, he also knew it wasn't enough to just gather words. At some point, he would have to stand face to face with Ryder again, and this time, it would not be with fists alone, but with truth sharp enough to cut through the gang's lies. The cameras clicked furiously as the room shifted from quiet anticipation to raw electricity. Keanu's voice carried an unusual weight, not because he shouted, but because he refused to. He spoke of compassion, of choices made in weakness and strength, and of how love, even when fractured, still deserved protection. His words were not rehearsed lines for a film, nor carefully polished sound bites for the press. They were stripped down, personal, and painfully human. He admitted his flaws, mistakes, and the times he had fallen short, but he spoke with a conviction that no tabloid could distort. For the first time in years, people were not looking at Keanu Reeves, the movie star, but at Keanu Reeves, the man, a brother, a son, a partner who had loved and lost, yet still stood determined to defend what mattered most. Some reporters lowered their cameras. Others paused mid-scribble, as though the rawness of his words had unsettled the performance they expected. Even online, the live stream comments began to turn. People who had logged on expecting scandal now wrote about empathy, forgiveness, and strength. In that moment, Keanu was no longer on trial. He was leading a conversation the world hadn't realized it needed. Keanu's words rippled outward like a tide, but what followed was silence. Not hostile silence, not the quiet of dismissal, but the heavy pause of reflection. For the first time in days, headlines stopped spinning accusations, and networks replayed his full speech instead of cutting it into fragments. The cameras that had once hunted for sound bites now lingered on his expression, his steady voice, the unshakable calm he carried. Behind the scenes, editors debated whether his message was too earnest for prime time, but something undeniable had shifted. Emails began to pour into newsrooms, viewers writing that they felt moved, not by scandal or spectacle, but by the courage of a man refusing to sling mud. Social media threads, once dripping with cynicism, filled with clips of his appeal, reshared by strangers who rarely agreed on anything. "This feels different," one trending post read. "For once, it's not about winning a fight. It's about finding a way forward." Even journalists who had mocked him before found themselves pausing. Some still scoffed, sure, but others admitted, reluctantly, that sincerity had pierced through the noise. They replayed the part where his voice trembled ever so slightly when he spoke of children learning honesty, of families teaching forgiveness. Back home, Keanu sat quietly, watching none of it. He had said his piece and let it go. For him, the act of speaking had been enough, a way of staying true to himself. What the world did with it was out of his hands. But the world, it seemed, wasn't ready to let go. His plea had struck deeper than anyone expected, and though the storm had not yet cleared, a new current was pulling people together. Something fragile, but undeniably real, had begun. The night fell heavy over Los Angeles, a sky bruised with low clouds and the faint pulse of neon leaking from distant streets. Keanu walked alone, the soles of his boots crunching against gravel as he made his way toward the part of town where whispers said Ryder and his gang held court. Shadow remained at home under watchful care, and though leaving him tore at Keanu's heart, this was something he needed to face without distraction. He turned a corner and stopped. Ahead of him, the bar came into view, its sign cracked and buzzing faintly with half-dead light bulbs that spelled out the name Steel Fang. Outside, the parking lot looked like an armed camp. Motorcycles were lined up in rows, their chrome glinting in the dim glow, their frames looming like steel beasts waiting for a command. The smell of gasoline and cigarette smoke hung thick in the air. Each bike was marked with the same emblem, a snarling tiger's head, fangs bared and claws extended. Beneath it was the word Tiger Claw. Keanu felt his stomach tighten. He had heard of them before. Tiger Claw wasn't just a street crew. It was a name tied to smuggling routes, drug trafficking, and violence that often ended in funerals. This wasn't just Ryder's personal gang. It was a larger network, a machine that fed off fear and silence. Confronting them meant stepping into the belly of something far bigger than a single man's cruelty. The bar doors opened with a slam, and a burst of noise spilled into the night. Music blared from a jukebox inside, drowned out at intervals by the roar of voices, shouts, curses, laughter that carried the edge of menace. Keanu watched two bikers stumble out with arms around each other's shoulders, reeking of alcohol, their jackets emblazoned with the Tiger Claw insignia. They barely noticed him as they lurched toward the line of bikes. Keanu waited until they were gone before he moved closer. His heart pounded, but his stride remained steady. He had walked onto countless sets playing men with steel nerves, but now there was no script, no safety net. This was real, and it demanded the same calm resolve he had shown in the clinic when Shadow's life hung in the balance. He pushed the door open and stepped inside. The stench hit him first. Beer, sweat, smoke, and the metallic tang of blood somewhere in the back. The room was a storm of chaos. Tables were packed with men and women draped in leather, their fists slamming down in rhythm with a drinking chant. A dartboard hung crooked on one wall, surrounded by holes where knives had missed their mark. In the far corner, two locals stood pale and trembling, while a group of bikers jeered, shoving them back and forth like prey caught in a cruel game. "The shit is going on in there!" shouted one of them. Keanu's eyes scanned the room quickly. Every detail mattered: the layout, the exits, the number of men, the way their insignias marked them as more than just street thugs. Each jacket was a brand of allegiance, a warning. Then he saw him. Ryder sat at the center of it all, one boot propped on a table, a bottle clutched in his hand. His laughter boomed above the rest, arrogant and cruel. He mimed a kicking motion as he spoke, his audience erupting in howls. Keanu didn't need to hear every word to know what he was boasting about. Shadow, the dog he had tried to break. Keanu's fists curled at his sides, his breath sharp as he forced himself not to charge forward. His rage could not lead here, not yet. He needed to listen, to see, to gather what he came for. This was the enemy's den, and one wrong move would end it before it began. Still, when Ryder leaned back, laughing about how the mutt had whimpered like a sick pup, Keanu's vision darkened. His teeth clenched until his jaw ached. Every instinct screamed for him to cross the room and end it with his fists. But instead, he stepped deeper into the shadows by the door, his resolve burning hotter. This night was not about vengeance. It was about truth, and the proof that Ryder and Tiger Claw had finally shown their hand. The whispers turned into headlines overnight. Keanu's confession to his ex shocks Hollywood, one read. Another splashed across screens. A love that never died? Though he had spoken with honesty and humility, the media twisted his words into spectacle. Paparazzi swarmed him at airports, outside restaurants, even outside his home. Tabloids painted him as a man pining helplessly, while online forums debated whether his revelation was brave or foolish. Yet, amid the noise, something unexpected happened. Letters began pouring in, not just from fans, but from ordinary people who had once lost someone they loved. Some through choice, others through tragedy. They thanked him for his vulnerability, for reminding them that feelings do not have expiration dates. "You gave me courage to call my first love," one woman wrote. "I had been silent for 20 years." Keanu read each message carefully, humbled by the realization that his personal truth was becoming a mirror for countless others. Though the headlines were messy, he could not deny the quiet movement building beneath them. For the first time since his confession, he felt that maybe the storm had purpose. The tension slowly unraveled, not through words, but through the simple act of being present. They didn't solve years of absence in a single conversation, but in the way his mother's hand lingered on his, in the way Keanu helped her to the car with careful steadiness. There was the quiet acknowledgement of love that had always been there, buried beneath time and regret. As the car pulled away from the ruins of the past, she turned her face toward him. Her lips trembled as if to speak, but instead she rested her head lightly on his shoulder. Keanu let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. In that silent gesture, he felt something shift. An unspoken promise that healing could begin, not with grand declarations, but with fragile moments of truth finally allowed to breathe. The air inside the Steel Fang bar shifted the moment Keanu stepped forward from the shadows. The music seemed to dull, the shouts and jeers tapered, and within seconds, every head in the smoky room turned toward him. Leather jackets gleamed under the dim light, insignias flashing like warnings. Cigarettes paused mid-drag, bottles froze midway to mouths, and a heavy silence pressed down over the chaos. Keanu stood tall in the doorway, his presence cutting through the noise more sharply than any weapon could. Ryder's laughter broke the quiet first, booming across the room as if to claim ownership of the space. He leaned back in his chair, his boots still propped arrogantly on the table, his grin stretching wide. "Well, well, look who decided to crawl back," Ryder sneered. "Back for round 2, movie star?" His gang howled with laughter, slapping tables, jeering, egging on their leader. Keanu didn't flinch. His eyes locked on Ryder, his voice even, unshaken. "I didn't come here for a fight," he said. His words cut through the taunts like a blade, calm but edged with authority. "I came here because you're going to pay, not just for what you did to my dog, but for what you've done to this community." A murmur rippled through the room. Some of the bikers exchanged glances, caught off guard by his composure. Ryder, however, only grinned wider, tapping ash from his cigarette. "You hear that, boys? Hollywood thinks he's a sheriff now." He leaned forward, his smirk twisting. "Let me guess, you're gonna call the cops, record us on your fancy phone, maybe give us a lecture about right and wrong?" The gang erupted again, their laughter ringing with cruelty. But Keanu didn't waver. His stance remained rooted, his expression resolute. He spoke louder this time, his voice steady enough to carry to the back of the room. "This isn't about me. This is about every small business you've shaken down, every neighbor you've threatened, every family you've left afraid to walk their own streets. You've built your power on fear. But that ends tonight." The laughter faltered, not entirely, but enough to shift the tone. A few faces in the crowd turned serious, their eyes darting toward Ryder, waiting for his reaction. Ryder's smirk wavered for just a heartbeat before he spat onto the floor, his jaw tightening. He rose slowly from his chair, towering with false swagger. "Big words," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "But words don't mean much in here." He stepped closer, the air between them thick with menace. "You want to play hero? Heroes bleed just like the rest of us." His fist clenched, his body tense, and for a moment it seemed certain that fists would fly. Keanu didn't move. He simply held Ryder's gaze, unshaken, his calm composure a weapon of its own. "You're right," he said softly. "Heroes bleed. But so do cowards who hurt the innocent." His words landed like a stone dropped into water, their ripples spreading across the room. The gang shifted uneasily, some whispering, some waiting for Ryder's signal. The tension grew unbearable, the kind that precedes a storm. Ryder snarled, his fist twitching at his side. The room braced for violence. But Keanu remained still, his hands loose at his sides, his jaw steady. He knew he wasn't alone. He had prepared for this moment. And when Ryder finally stepped into striking distance, Keanu's eyes flicked, just for a second, toward the door. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but deliberate. A quiet signal. Someone outside was waiting. The crowd erupted with cheers, not just for the Dolphins, but for the man who had stood at the heart of it all. Keanu didn't bask in the spotlight. He simply waved once, quietly stepping back as if to give the animals all the credit. But Olivia caught the change in his expression. The shadows of their past argument seemed to dissolve in the salt air, replaced by something softer, humbler. She reached for his arm, squeezing gently. "You didn't have to risk yourself like that," she said, her voice trembling with both awe and fear. Keanu shook his head. "I couldn't just stand there. Sometimes we only get one chance to make a difference." His words carried a weight far greater than the moment, and Olivia felt it in her chest. Around them, children laughed, pointing as the dolphins leapt once more before disappearing into the open sea. The rescue became more than an act of heroism. It was a symbol of how fragile life was and how courage and compassion could restore hope in an instant. And in that fleeting silence after the applause, Keanu and Olivia knew their own rescue was just beginning. The crowd at the pier erupted in applause, a wave of cheers echoing over the water. Reporters lowered their cameras, no longer searching for scandal, but capturing a story of redemption. For once, Keanu didn't retreat into the shadows. He lifted his head, soaked, smiling faintly, as if the storm outside had finally passed. Lena rushed forward, her hair dripping and tangled, but her arms steady as she helped him secure the dolphin's release. Together they watched as the creature surged into the open sea, leaping once before disappearing into the vast horizon. The moment felt symbolic. An untamed spirit, once trapped, now free again. Keanu turned to Lena, breathless, his chest rising and falling. "We can't change the past," he said softly, almost drowned out by the ocean. "But maybe we can choose what we set free." For a heartbeat, Lena only stared, her face shifting through pain, memory, and something close to hope. Then, with trembling fingers, she touched his arm, not in forgiveness, not yet, but in recognition of the man standing before her. The pier buzzed with voices, but Keanu barely noticed. What mattered was the weight lifting from his shoulders. The rescue hadn't just been about saving a dolphin. It had been about proving to Lena, to the world, and most of all to himself, that his love was not empty, his actions not hollow. As the sun pierced through the thinning storm clouds, Keanu felt a strange peace settle over him. The battle wasn't over. The media storm would rage, mistakes would still haunt him, and Lena's forgiveness was far from certain. But for the first time in years, he believed he could fight, not with words, but with deeds that mattered. The bar had become a battlefield. Chairs were splintered, bottles shattered, and the floor slick with spilled beer and blood. Ryder's gang fought with a feral desperation, trying to reclaim their dominance even as the tide turned against them. Keanu stood tall in the center of it all, his breathing heavy but controlled, his eyes locked on the chaos unraveling around him. Elena, who had followed against his wishes, clung to the shadows near the jukebox, her hands trembling but her gaze unflinching. She had come to testify, and there was no turning back. The sound of sirens cut through the roar of the fight, first faint, then rising, until they drowned out the crashing tables and curses. Tires screeched outside, gravel flying as headlights poured through the cracked windows. The gang hesitated. For the first time that night, a flash of fear rippled across their faces. Then the door burst open. Sheriff Hank Morrison stepped inside, his broad frame filling the doorway like a wall of justice. His uniform was dusted from the long ride, his badge catching the dim light, and his jaw set with grim determination. Behind him, deputies surged in with shotguns and batons, their voices commanding authority. "Sheriff's office, everyone stand down," Hank's voice boomed across the room. It was the kind of voice that silenced a storm. But Ryder wasn't finished. He spat blood onto the floor and laughed, his chest heaving with defiance. "You think some small-town lawman scares me?" he barked, pointing a broken bottle at the sheriff. His gang rallied, though their courage wavered with every step closer the deputies took. Keanu positioned himself in front of Elena, shielding her from the sudden shift of attention. His eyes met Hank's for a brief moment. Years of friendship and trust exchanged in that silent glance. They didn't need words. Both men knew what had to be done. The deputies clashed with the gang. Batons cracked against arms, knees slammed into stomachs, and the remaining bikers were dragged down one by one. Some fought back with raw desperation. Others tried to bolt for the door, only to be slammed into the wall and cuffed. The bar was filled with grunts, curses, and the metallic clink of handcuffs. Keanu caught one biker lunging toward Elena, a knife flashing in his hand. With lightning reflexes, Keanu intercepted him, twisting the man's wrist until the blade clattered to the floor. A sharp kick sent him sprawling. Elena gasped, her hand flying to her mouth, but her eyes never left Keanu. She had never seen someone fight with such precision and control. He wasn't brutal, he wasn't reckless. He was deliberate. Every move meant to protect. Hank pushed through the melee, his eyes locked on Ryder. "It's over," he growled. "You've got nowhere left to run." Ryder sneered, his lip curling like a cornered wolf. He charged anyway, swinging the jagged bottle straight for Hank's face. The sheriff sidestepped and drove his fist into Ryder's gut with the force of a hammer. Ryder staggered but refused to go down. He lunged again, snarling, but Keanu was there, grabbing his arm mid-swing. Together, Hank and Keanu forced him to the ground, pinning him until the cuffs clicked around his wrists. The room finally stilled. Deputies stood over groaning bikers, weapons lowered but ready. The smell of sweat, alcohol, and blood hung heavy in the air. Broken glass crunched under boots as silence reclaimed the space. Elena emerged slowly from her hiding spot, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "I saw everything. I'll testify." Keanu placed a hand gently on her shoulder, guiding her toward safety. His gaze shifted to Ryder, now cuffed and kneeling on the dirty floor. His hair matted with sweat, his pride shattered, but his hatred burning hotter than ever. Ryder's chest rose and fell with ragged breaths, his eyes locked on Keanu's. filled with venom. "This isn't over!" Ryder bellowed, his voice echoing against the broken walls. Deputies dragged him to his feet, but his scream carried long after he was shoved toward the waiting squad cars outside. The bar was ruined, but for the first time, justice felt close. Elena's courage had not been wasted. The sheriff's arrival had changed everything. But everyone knew Ryder's threat was not empty. The war wasn't done. It was only entering its next phase. The judge leaned forward, her gavel resting loosely in her hand. "Mr. Reeves, you've made some compelling points. But do you understand the weight of what you're asking this court to acknowledge?" Keanu nodded, his voice steady though the silence in the room felt like a storm waiting to break. "I understand, Your Honor. I'm not here to play at being clever or to embarrass anyone. I'm here because someone has to be. If justice only bends toward those with the loudest voices, the wealthiest pockets, or the deepest influence, then it isn't justice at all. It's theater. And I refuse to let this trial become theater." For the first time, a murmur rose from the jury box. Even they seemed caught by the unusual blend of humility and strength in his words. The prosecutor shuffled his papers, searching for a retort, but his usual arsenal of intimidation felt blunted. The audience leaned forward, sensing the imbalance of power beginning to tilt. Keanu lifted his hand slightly, as if holding something invisible. The law is supposed to be a compass, not a weapon. Today, we get to decide whether it points true north or whether we bend the needle to serve our pride. The words hung there, echoing across wood-paneled walls and solemn faces. For a moment, it wasn't just a legal case. It was something larger, something elemental. The judge drew in a breath, her expression softening almost imperceptibly. She looked to the prosecutor. "Do you have a response?" The silence that followed was answer enough. Keanu extended his hand toward the boy, the silence pressing like a tide. The child hesitated, then placed his tiny fingers in his palm. Cameras flashed wildly, but for that instant, the world fell away. Only trust remained, fragile yet unshakable. Wordlessly, history had been rewritten. Morning light spilled over Los Angeles with a strange stillness, the kind that follows a storm. The neighborhood that had lived in fear for months now awoke to something different. The sound of silence where engines once roared. The absence of boots stomping down sidewalks. The uneasy realization that the Tiger Claw gang had finally been cut down. Local television vans lined the block near the Steel Fang bar. Their antennas reached into the sky, and reporters spoke urgently into cameras as the red live banners blinked on screens across the city. The raid had become the story of the morning. Grainy footage played of deputies hauling out bikers in cuffs, evidence bags piled into trucks, and crates of contraband being cataloged. "Breaking news," one anchor said, her voice sharp with both outrage and triumph. "Authorities have dismantled one of the most dangerous biker networks in Los Angeles. The Tiger Claw gang, operating under the cover of a downtown bar, has been implicated in extortion, narcotics trafficking, and even acts of animal cruelty." Clips rolled of smashed bottles, overturned tables, and bikers being forced to the ground by deputies. The camera lingered on Ryder, his face twisted in rage as he was shoved into the back of a squad car. His muffled scream of, "This isn't over," played across every channel. A final image of a man who had once held power, now reduced to shackled defiance. Neighbors began to gather near the barricades, their voices raised not in fear but in celebration. Small business owners who had paid protection money now spoke to reporters, describing the harassment they had endured. A cafe owner choked up as she explained how the gang had threatened her family, her words breaking, but her relief unmistakable. A mechanic from the corner shop raised his hands high, his voice carrying, "We've been living under their shadow for too long. Tonight, we can breathe again." The Steel Fang sign flickered and died as deputies hammered a wooden board across the entrance. Reporters captured the moment, declaring it a symbolic end to a reign of intimidation. Children peeked out from behind their parents, their eyes wide as they watched the gang's lair sealed shut like a tomb. Yet one name remained absent from the reports: Keanu's. Sheriff Hank Morrison had ensured it. When pressed for details about the raid, Hank told the cameras only that the operation was the result of months of careful investigation and cooperation with the community. He did not mention the man who had walked into the den alone, who had faced Ryder with unshakable resolve, who had risked his life to protect both witnesses and truth. To the world, Keanu Reeves had not been there. Inside the quiet of a nearby diner, Keanu sat with a cup of untouched coffee cooling before him. The television above the counter played the very broadcasts that were spreading across the city, but he barely looked up. He wasn't interested in recognition. Fame had never mattered to him, and certainly not now. All that mattered was shadow. He stared at his hands, remembering the weight of his dog collapsing in his arms, the sound of his whimpers, the feel of his still body against his chest. Victory in the streets meant nothing if Shadow didn't survive. His eyes lifted briefly to the TV, only when they mentioned animal cruelty, his jaw tightening. They didn't know how personal that was. They couldn't know. He left the diner quietly, slipping past the noise of celebration and the hum of live broadcasts. He didn't linger to hear the cheers or see the bar boarded up. Instead, he walked steadily toward the clinic, his stride purposeful, his heart tethered to the one life that still hung in the balance. For the city, the story was about justice served and a gang destroyed. For Keanu, the story wasn't finished. It wouldn't be until he saw Shadow's eyes open again. The evening of the summit unfolded like a charged storm. Cameras flashed, the hall packed with journalists, diplomats, and ordinary citizens who had been invited to witness what was being called the gathering of conscience. Keanu sat quietly at the edge of the stage, not at the center, a deliberate choice that showed he wasn't here for prestige. Steven Seagal stood nearby, arms folded, his imposing frame strangely protective of the fragile hope in the room. When Keanu finally rose, his voice carried not with volume but with weight. He spoke of fractured families, of communities silenced by violence, of nations too often blinded by greed. Yet he didn't dwell on despair. He told stories of farmers standing firm against gangs, of young people daring to dream, of neighbors choosing kindness over fear. His words painted pictures that no headline could contain. And then came the moment that silenced even the skeptics. Keanu invited a single mother, once trapped by gang extortion, to the stage. Trembling, she told the world how their small acts of defiance, shared courage, and solidarity had given her life back. The hall erupted in applause, not for him, but for her. The media firestorm didn't fade overnight, but something had shifted. Instead of headlines mocking Keanu's presence at the gala, new articles asked harder questions. Why had a man known for generosity and humility been treated with contempt by those who claimed refinement? Talk shows replayed the moment not to laugh, but to highlight his restraint. It takes more strength to rise above humiliation than to strike back, one commentator observed. For Keanu, the storm was never about himself. He thought of the countless workers who lived invisible lives under the shadow of wealth. Servers, janitors, clerks, people dismissed for their clothes or accents. They carried the same wounds he had felt that night, though without the platform to turn shame into conversation. As the chatter swelled, Keanu remained silent. But in his quietness, people found something louder than outrage: dignity. It wasn't the tuxedo or the mistake or even the dinner. It was how he carried himself afterward. And slowly, the story stopped being about a misunderstood movie star and became about something deeper. A lesson in how dignity could disarm cruelty and how silence could echo louder than scorn. The clinic was quiet, the kind of quiet that felt heavy with waiting. The bustle of the news vans, the chatter of neighbors celebrating the end of the gang, all of it had faded into the background. Keanu's world had narrowed to a single hallway, a single door, and the fragile hope that waited beyond it. His footsteps slowed as he approached the recovery room, his palms damp despite the cool air. He braced himself, unsure of what he would find. When he pushed the door open, his heart caught in his throat. Shadow lay curled on a padded blanket, his body still thin from the ordeal, a small bandage around his foreleg where the IV line had been. Machines hummed quietly nearby, their steady rhythm the only reassurance that life still pulsed through him. For a moment, Keanu stood frozen, afraid that any movement might shatter the fragile peace of the room. Then Shadow's eyes fluttered open. They were hazy, weak, but the moment they found Keanu, recognition lit them with a faint glow. His tail gave the smallest wag, slow and shaky, but it was enough to bring Keanu to his knees beside him. Emotion surged up his throat, his hand trembling as he stroked Shadow's fur. "You made it, buddy," Keanu whispered, his voice breaking. "You're still here." Shadow's head shifted slightly, pressing into his palm. His breath was shallow but steady, and the warmth of his body under Keanu's hand felt like the answer to every prayer whispered in desperation over the last days. Keanu lowered his forehead to rest gently against Shadow's, his eyes squeezing shut as the tears finally spilled. The weight he had carried, the guilt, the anger, the fear, began to unravel in that quiet moment of reunion. The door opened softly behind him, and Dr. Harper stepped inside. Her face, lined with fatigue from hours of vigilance, softened into a small, reassuring smile. "He's going to make it," she said, her voice firm but kind. "It was close, closer than I like to admit. But you got him here fast, and that saved him. His strength did the rest." Keanu turned, his hand never leaving Shadow's side. "Thank you," he said, his words hoarse but sincere. "For everything." Dr. Harper shook her head. "You don't have to thank me. You're the reason he's alive. Most people would have frozen or panicked, but you carried him here without wasting a second. That gave us the chance to work." She glanced at Shadow, then back at Keanu. "He'll need time, rest, and care, but he's past the worst of it." Keanu nodded, swallowing hard against the lump in his throat. Relief coursed through him, powerful and unsteady, leaving his hands trembling as he stroked Shadow's ear. He leaned closer, whispering, "We made it, buddy. Together." Shadow's tail gave another weak wag, and Keanu felt it like a promise, fragile yet unbreakable. He thought of every moment they had shared, the walks through quiet streets, the nights when Shadow's steady breathing had been his comfort, the loyalty that had never wavered. Losing him would have been like losing a part of himself, but here, now, in this small room filled with machines and quiet resolve, life had tilted back toward hope. Keanu sat with him, unwilling to leave, unwilling to let even a second pass without his hand resting on Shadow's fur. The fear of almost losing him had carved something permanent into his heart, a vow. Never again would he allow Shadow out of his sight. Never again would he underestimate the cruelty of men like Ryder. From now on, every step, every moment, they would face together. Outside, the city celebrated, but inside the clinic, Keanu found something greater than victory. He found his companion alive, his bond unbroken, and a future that still stretched before them. The letter's weight pressed on him like an anchor. Every line of Isabella's handwriting seemed alive, echoing the very heartbeat of a woman who had shaped his mother's earliest days. For Keanu, this wasn't just history. It was a bridge across generations, binding him to a legacy he hadn't known existed. He read aloud a few passages, his voice low and reverent, and Patricia leaned closer, tears streaking silently down her cheek. She whispered almost to herself, "I can hear her. I can feel her. Here." Keanu folded the letter carefully, as if it were a sacred artifact. He placed it back into the envelope and rested it against his chest. "This isn't the end," he said firmly, looking at his mother. "It's the beginning of something she wanted us to carry forward." Patricia nodded, her grief softening into gratitude. Together they sat in quiet reflection, the letter resting between them like a promise that Isabella's spirit would never fade. Keanu rose from the table, the lights casting a warm halo over him. He paused, his hand resting gently on the back of his mother's chair, his voice steady yet filled with reverence. "We've walked through fire, through silence, through storms," he said softly, his eyes sweeping across the room. "But tonight proves that love can outlast every shadow. It proves that family, no matter how fractured, can be mended." The crowd responded with thunderous applause, many standing, some openly weeping. Patricia wiped her tears, squeezing his hand with all the strength of a proud mother. Steven Seagal clapped slowly, a look of quiet admiration crossing his rugged face. The waitress, who had first welcomed them months ago, covered her mouth in awe, realizing she was witnessing something far greater than a speech. It was a legacy unfolding. As the room swelled with emotion, Keanu stepped back, letting the silence settle once more. In that silence lived the power of everything they had endured. The moment was no longer just about him, or even about his family. It had become something universal. A reminder that even broken lives could be healed, and that hope could rise from ashes. A year had passed, and Los Angeles wore a different face. The graffiti that once screamed warnings on every wall had been painted over with bright murals of hope and unity. The roar of motorcycles no longer stalked the streets at night. Instead, children's laughter drifted through the air, mingling with the soft chatter of neighbors no longer afraid to gather outside their shops and homes. The city had healed slowly, scar by scar, but it had healed. Keanu walked these streets with Shadow at his side, the leash loose in his hand. The pit bull moved with a calm confidence, his coat gleaming, his gait strong and steady. Gone were the days of staggering under the weight of poison, of lying on clinic floors fighting for breath. Now Shadow's chest rose and fell with power, his eyes bright with life, his tail wagging gently as he received waves and pats from passing locals. To the people of this neighborhood, Shadow was more than a dog. He was a survivor, a symbol of endurance. The cafe owner who once feared riders' threats stepped outside, smiling warmly as she handed Keanu a fresh cup of coffee. "On the house," she said. "For the man who gave us back our nights." Keanu accepted with a nod. His gratitude shone not in words, but in the quiet kindness of his eyes. Across the street, Victor, the mechanic, leaned against the doorway of his shop, giving Keanu a salute of respect. The small business owners who had once been shaken down for protection money now thrived together, their voices no longer silenced by fear. What Keanu had risked that night in the den, what the sheriff had carried out with law and justice, had given them back something priceless: dignity. As Keanu walked, he thought about how fragile all of it had been, how one dog's life had nearly been snuffed out by cruelty, and how that cruelty had opened a door to a greater battle for justice. He remembered the look in Ryder's eyes, the venom of a man who thrived on fear. But he remembered something else too: the quiet wag of Shadow's tail, even in pain, the loyalty that had not broken even as his body had weakened. That was what had carried Keanu forward. That was what had given him the strength to face men who lived only to destroy. He paused at the fountain near the square, the same one Shadow had tugged toward that first day, long before the violence had erupted. He knelt down and let Shadow drink from the cool stream, his hand resting gently on the dog's back. Around him, the streets were alive with peace, yet his mind wandered to the storm they had endured together. He thought about how loyalty wasn't just a word, it was an anchor, a compass, a shield. It was what bound man and dog in ways no cruelty could sever. Keanu whispered, not for anyone else to hear, only for Shadow. "We made it through, didn't we? You and me?" Shadow lifted his head, water dripping from his muzzle, and wagged his tail as if to answer. Keanu smiled faintly, brushing his fingers through the fur on his neck. Justice had come to the community, but for Keanu, the truest victory was here at his side. Shadow breathing, Shadow walking, Shadow alive. The rest of the world could celebrate the fall of Tiger Claw, but for Keanu, triumph was spelled in paw prints beside him. The restaurant returned to its natural rhythm, yet the memory of the night lingered in every corner. Waiters whispered about it while polishing glasses, and guests carried it with them long after leaving. For Keanu, it was never about the applause. It was about the look in Steven's eyes, the relief on the waitress's face, the sense that for one night, kindness and humility had prevailed over pride. Steven raised his glass one last time, meeting Keanu's gaze with a nod that said more than words could. It wasn't just respect. It was friendship sealed in quiet understanding. The waitress, now calmer, slipped into the kitchen with tears of gratitude shining in her eyes. She had seen not just two celebrities, but two men who chose compassion over conflict. The lesson was clear. True strength wasn't found in dominance or intimidation. It was in the grace to rise above. The hotel's courtyard had been transformed into a quiet garden of light. Lanterns hung from trees, swayed gently in the night breeze, casting soft golden glows across the gathered crowd. Employees, locals, and even travelers who had once been turned away stood side by side. What had begun as a story of exclusion had blossomed into a gathering of gratitude. Keanu stepped forward, his voice carrying with a sincerity that silenced the night. He spoke not of wealth nor fame, but of the simple belief that dignity belongs to everyone. "What matters," he said, pausing with emotion catching in his throat, "is how we treat the person at our doorstep, whether they carry gold or only their tired hands." The words struck deep, and a hush fell before the courtyard erupted in applause. Among the crowd, the hotel's elderly doorman, once ashamed for enforcing the rules that denied him, wept openly. Keanu approached, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You're part of the change now," he told him quietly, "and that means more than what came before." The man nodded, his tears mingling with relief. As the night wound down, Keanu didn't stand on a stage or bask in admiration. He moved among the people, listening to their stories, shaking their hands, making each one feel seen. His legacy in that place wasn't the building he owned. It was the circle of kindness that would ripple outward long after he left. And as he finally stepped into the quiet of the night, a thought lingered, not just for him but for everyone present. Sometimes the smallest act of compassion could open doors grander than any hotel could ever build.